The first study that I'm going to cover, so this section of the lecture gives you some emblematic studies done in the social sciences. And I've chosen these 5 studies because they both show how the different social sciences approach a particular problem and how they are going to study a particular problem. And I'm also going to raise some of the ethical issues that may be involved in some of these studies. And I really want to give you a taste for how exciting these social sciences can be and to show you the wide variety of questions that social scientists can actually ask. So the first study we're going to look at is called Gang Leader for a Day and was written by Sudhir Venkatesh when he was a graduate student. And originally what Venkatesh did is he wanted to study street gangs. And he wanted to study street gangs using questionnaires. So he went out to a street gang, the Black Kings, and he met the leader of the Black Kings, JT. And JT said, you know what? Questionnaires are not going to work in this group. If you want to study street gangs, you need to come to become one of us. You need to infiltrate us and become a gang member. And Venkatesh said, okay, I'll become one of you. And so he hung out with the gang for a couple of years. And he got unprecedented access to their drug dealing operations, including crime operations. He spent one day as a gang leader to understand the role that JT was in. And he studied typical sociological questions such as the gang hierarchy and power structures, local business relationships, community organizations, housing authority dynamics. And what he found is that there was complex economic and social structures within the projects. He documented both legal and illegal economies. He obtained years of drug dealing ledgers from one of the members, and he also observed how community functions through informal power. Now, some of the questions that arise from Venkatesh's study is how ethical was it? For example, he participated in illegal activities, in criminal activities. Now, he did not himself personally commit any crimes, but he was present when crimes were committed. He did not report them to the police. Now, the ethical question arises, who does he have his loyalties to? The gang that he is studying, or society as a whole who is at a risk from the criminal activities that is being done by this gang? So these are some of the ethical questions that come up when you go undercover, which sociologists do. This is a method, Venkatesh's method is called ethnography. And so this was an ethnographic study. Anthropologists also do ethnography, but instead of studying, for example, the economic and social structures like Venkatesh did when he did his ethnography, an anthropologist might study the culture of the gang and how the gang talks to each other, how the gang shares resources, things like that. So, trying to slow down. The next study that I'm going to cover is some sociology, and it's called Are You a Natural? The Minnesota Study of Twins Reared Apart. And it was written by Bouchard, Lycan, McGee, Segal, and Tellegen. It was published in 1990. You may have heard about this study. It was a very interesting study in which they took twins who were I'll tell you about the study in a minute. But basically, the traditional view is that the environment shapes personality and behavior. And this is typically attributed to parenting and family influences, key life experiences, educational experiences, and social interactions. And genetic influence is mainly recognized for the physical traits. Do we share the same eye color? Do we share the same height? Do we share the same weight? That kind of thing. However, what these scientists did is they wanted to look at identical twins who were separated at birth to see how much biological factors or how much social factors influence things such as personality traits, intelligence, aptitude, like what kinds of jobs they went into, their life history, and their family environment. And what they found is that genetic factors account for significant variation in human characteristics. And so these twins who were raised apart showed remarkable similarities despite different environments. So, for example, intelligence had a 70% genetic influence. Historically, psychologists thought that intelligence was mostly based on how you were reared, how you were raised. And they found that 70% of intelligence could be traced back to genetic influence. Personality traits, like how outgoing you are, how reactive you are, how easily irritable you are, 40% genetic influence. Now, a really interesting one, job satisfaction, 30% genetic influence. They also found that a lot of these twins who were raised apart went into similar job fields. So they found, for example, that some of these twins, both of them were firefighters, or both of them were teachers, or both of them were in business, even though they were reared apart in totally different environments by totally different families. They went into the same jobs, and their job satisfaction had a 30% genetic influence. Behavioral traits, so such as reaction time, like how fast you react in the car, to how religious you are, so show genetic components. So this is a really interesting psychology study because it actually shows a lot of biological influence for things that we thought used to be more psychological or societal or cultural in nature. So the major implications of the study, of course, is that while genetic influence doesn't limit potential improvement, it still accounts for up to 30% of 70% of variation. Environmental impact. Family environments may have less influence than previously thought. However, they emphasize that parents can still create positive influence. So even though, for example, job satisfaction was influenced by genetics up to 30% of the time, or 30% of the job satisfaction is influenced by biology, 70% of it can still be influenced by your environment. And lastly, what they found is that there is a gene environment interaction. So people's genetic tendencies may shape their environments. So, for example, if you have a genetic tendency towards risk taking, you may shape your environment to lean towards becoming a firefighter, for example. So, if two people both have a genetic tendency towards risk taking, they may both end up as firefighters, for example. And these genetic predispositions guide self-selected experiences. So your genetic predisposition to being a risk taker may guide you to become a firefighter. Now, the next study we're going to look at is within the realm of anthropology. This is a more recent study, and it's called It's Complicated, The Social Life of Networked Teens, and it's written by Dina Boyd. And I want to make a note here. I've used a font that capitalizes everything, but Boyd actually uses lowercase d and lowercase b for their first and last name. So if you look them up, it's actually Dana Boyd with a lowercase d and a lowercase b. Anyway, so within It's Complicated, what Dana Boyd did is they wanted to look at the fundamental activities online that teens are engaging in. And there's a lot of angst right now with teens being online, and they're on Instagram, they're on Facebook, they're on all of these different platforms. And there's a concern among parents and teachers that teens are being exposed to sexual exploitation, that they're being exposed to privacy breaches, that they are being exposed to risk basically online. And what Boyd found is that the key activities that teens are doing online is not any different than what they were doing in person. They're still chatting and socializing. They're still self-expressing. They're still grappling with media. Pardon me, they're still grappling with privacy issues, and they're still sharing media and information. So these activities have not changed. The only thing that has changed is the persistence of them. So the fact, for example, that if I have a conversation with you online, it stays online forever. The visibility of that communication. If I'm talking to you in person in a private corner, it's just between you and me. If we're talking online, it's visible to who knows who. Searchability and spreadability. Of course, it can be spread to other people. It can be searched. So what Boyd found is what Boyd determined is that there's a difference between being in public and being public. So being public is the idea that in online spaces, you are public all the time because you are searchable, you are traceable, you are persistent, versus being in public, which is you and I maybe in a mall somewhere, in a movie theater, talking to each other. And maybe people are overhearing us, but that's very different from being public. And so what Boyd found is that being online challenges the traditional boundaries of identity and privacy among these teens who use online spaces. But Boyd's main arguments is that digital platforms mirror and magnify everyday life. So these teens are not going into online spaces that are totally new and foreign to them. It's just like everyday life, just a little bit bigger. So technology itself doesn't create or prevent harm. It just makes existing struggles more visible. So, for example, suicidality or bullying. We hear a lot about online bullying, for example. And a lot of parents act like, oh my God, online bullying is so awful, and our teens were not exposed to this before the internet. The fact is, bullying has existed forever. And Boyd argues that it just makes the existing struggle of bullying much more visible than it used to be. But there's always been bullying. Boyd also argues about teen agency and that young people actively manage digital identities and they are able to create new contextual norms and they are actually pioneering approaches to privacy management, such as creating whole new languages, such as creating whole new codes. And we all know internet shorthand such as TBH or BRB or whatever those are. But teens are creating all of these new languages and all of these new approaches to maintaining their privacy online. And lastly, Boyd argues that digital tools amplify the existing social inequalities and existing real world disparities that exist, and that technology is embedded in broader social structures. So, technology and digital tools itself are not creating the disparity, they only amplify existing disparities, existing inequities that exist. And so, this really goes back to the idea that I made in point number one, that technology is a mirror that makes the existing struggles more visible. It doesn't actually create the disparity; it actually just amplifies or makes them more visible. The next study that I'm going to talk about is in the field of economics, and it's called Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. Thomas Piketty is a very well-known economist coming out of France. And you will see right away on this slide, I have a bunch of R is greater than G. And this is what economists mean when they talk about models. So economists look at the same kinds of questions that a social scientist, that a political scientist might, or a sociologist might. So for example, sociologists look at inequality all the time. They look at capitalism all the time. But economists are unique is that they're going to come up with formulas like R is greater than G. And R, in Piketty's case, is the rate of return on capital is greater than the economic growth rate. So when the rate of return on capital is greater than the economic growth rate, wealth accumulates faster than economic growth. So the result is that concentration of wealth concentrates among your top percentiles, and without intervention, it threatens a democratic order. So again, these are all things that a sociologist or a political scientist might study, but economists are going to study it from this very specific kind of method by looking at formulas. So economists also do historical analysis, just like a sociologist might or a political scientist might, and you'll see that in a minute. But again, they look at it from a very different viewpoint. What Piketty did is he looked at something called he called the Great Leveling from 1930 to 1975. And he found that during the Great Leveling, there was a reduction in inequality due to the world wars, the Great Depression, and debt fueled recession. And these events destroyed elite wealth, prompted redistribution of wealth, and reduced the importance of inheritance. However, he found that because of his formula, remember, if we go back to his formula of when the rate of return is greater than the economic growth rate, he found that the growth rate is going to fall below the rate of return. And so the 20th century inequality that he found during the Great Leveling was an aberration. And that unless we intervene in the 21st century, we're going to find low economic growth, extreme inequality, technology alone won't ensure growth, and the returns on investment will outpace productivity-based income. So what does this mean to you and me? Basically, what this means to me as a sociologist is that inequality is going to get bigger. We're going to see a bigger gap between the rich and the poor. The richest and the poorest among us, the gap is going to get even bigger. The middle class is going to shrink. even more than it has already. And so this is what Piketty was able to find using his formula and using historical evaluation of economic markets and economic growth. And I am making good time. But I'm going to finish up with this last study, which is very, very relevant to today's society. It's called Twilight of Democracy. So this the seductive lure of authoritarianism, and it was written by Anne Applebaum in 2020. And what Anne Applebaum studied is the rise of right-wing populist politics. She studied Poland, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Hungary. And she really focused on what she calls the clerics. And the clerics are intellectuals who provide justification for authoritarianism. These people are highly educated, well traveled, and economically prosperous. So these are among the 1% or the top 1% of the 1%. Within the US, she identified Laura Ingraham as an example of a cleric in the US who was influencing authoritarianism and justifying authoritarianism within the United States. So, why do these people support authoritarianism? We usually say, according to Applebaum, we usually say that these people support authoritarianism because of fear of terrorism or immigration pressures or economic distress. But what Applebaum actually found is they're motivated by very personal motivations like career advancement, revenge against other elites, cultural despair, like, oh my God, there's too many gay people, there's too many trans people, or belief that other elites has degraded their countries. So there is popular support for authoritarianism. And why is there popular support for authoritarianism? We like the authoritarian personality traits, post-communist disillusionment, and disappointment with meritocracy. Now, meritocracy is a concept that people, if you try hard enough and you do a good job and you go to school and you work really hard, you're going to move up in the social ladder. And the fact of the matter is that doesn't always work that way, does it? A lot of us work really hard. We wake up at the same time every day. We go to work at the same time every day. We work really, really, really hard and we do really good. And we still are not moving up. The price of eggs is still $35. And so that kind of disappointment can lead us towards authoritarian leaders. And how is authoritarianism maintained? Through medium-sized lies, conspiracy theories, alternative realities, and rhetoric.